Hi, and welcome to the session on Overheating at Festival of Place Climate Resilience 2023. My name is Christine Murray. I'm the founding director of the Festival of Place and the developer. Heat risks have been identified as a top threat of climate change facing the UK over the next 5 years. It's an issue that should be considered alongside the need to insulate homes to address winter and summer deaths together. Insulation is often the solution to both problems, but some areas are only a priority when we factor in heat risk. So how should we assess this risk and prepare? What adaptations are needed, and does the new Part O go far enough? It's my great pleasure to welcome Hannah Giddings, Head of Resilience and Nature at UK GBC, who has studied overheating and is here to share her perspectives. Hannah's technical background is in sustainability consultancy, which has given her a grounded and evidenced understanding of the issues facing our built environment, helping her to create industry-leading frameworks for advocating for policy change, convening stakeholders to develop solutions to current sustainability issues, and authoring guidance such as recent reports on climate-related risks, the holistic value of nature-based solutions. Hannah has an MSc in Environmental Policy and Management from the University of Bristol and now sits on the Bristol Advisory Committee on Climate Change, advising on climate resilience and adaptation issues for the city. So please share some emoji applause and welcome Hannah to the stage.
Thank you very much. That was...
Hi, Hannah. Great to have you here.
Thank you. No, great to be here. That was a very nice introduction to me. Normally, I'm just saying, I'm Hannah Giddings and I'm Head of Resilience. No, that's fine. Shall I share my slides?
Yeah, go ahead and share your slide. I'll remind the audience we'll be taking your questions, so do think of them and type them in before the end of Hannah's talk. And also your chat and your Q&A are located over on the side panel. That looks brilliant, Hannah. I'll be back to field your questions.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I think I wanted to start off with a little question first before we get into the kind of detail of it. And this might be quite difficult to do for today because it's absolutely freezing where I am, and I'm sure it's probably the same for you as well. But I want you to cast your minds back to July 2022, specifically when the UK experienced its hottest ever temperatures. We managed to reach 40.3 degrees in Coningsby in Lincolnshire, so this was wildly beyond what we normally see in our summers. But in the chat, I would like to know from you, how did that make you feel? Was that, were you happy with that? Certain people do really like the hot temperatures and like going on some holidays, but for others, that wasn't quite a good experience. I don't know. Some people felt quite ill. Some people felt it was quite difficult to work. Others loved it. We're in the garden chilling, and that's absolutely fine. But yeah, how did the summer heat wave last year make you feel? Yes, Caroline, very sluggish. I completely agree with that. I found it very difficult to do my work. I think I was, unproductive, hard to sleep. Completely agree. Very difficult to just do normal life activities, I would say, and to engage brains. Not always easy to do in a heat wave. Amanda, loving, yes, appreciating the outdoors. It's nice if you have a nice space to go to, particularly for people who have gardens. That's lovely. Or nearby urban kind of green spaces. The kids had chicken pox. Very sorry to hear that, James. Okay, so yeah, Northern Scotland wasn't too bad, but yeah, not a fan of the sea. Okay, perfect. So second question, follow-up question. Did anyone change your behavior in any way? So did you perhaps do different things? Did you not go into the office, or did you adapt your house in any way or your place of work? A lot of people kind of shut the curtains a bit, but did anyone do anything different? Or perhaps think about maybe your water usage. Did that go up? Yeah, stayed at home more. Paddling pool. I love a good paddling pool. Amazing. Not wanting to cook. Okay, yeah, very interesting, because we don't want to increase the kind of internal temperatures we're feeling as well. Slept downstairs. So that's a very interesting one. Definitely one that I will be speaking about shortly. Which rooms do we naturally go to when it's hot? Buildings, particularly homes, are particularly oriented in certain ways. Do we need to kind of adapt that? Yes, air conditioning, definitely one that I'll come on to, Amanda. Thank you. Closed curtains, yeah, perfect. Okay, so I will stop there because otherwise we will just chat all day about how we felt in the heat wave. But the point very much is we are all affected by heat, stress, and hot temperatures when those kind of events happen. So it's one of those most important physical hazards for us to consider when we are either designing or retrofitting or managing our built environment. And my particular anecdote for this one is my neighbours all thought I was absolutely mad, but I ended up putting tin foil on my windows that are south facing, which really helped, but did kind of look like the house was a bit of a spaceship. So perhaps not the best thing to do. But what are we going to talk about today? So I'm Hannah Giddings, and as Christine introduced earlier, I'm the head of climate resilience and nature at the UK Green Building Council. And for those that aren't familiar with UK GBC and the work that we do, I just wanted to highlight what our kind of vision is. So for the built environment, we really want a vision that is an environment that enables people and planet to thrive, where we strongly believe that the built environment is part of the solution to the challenges that we face. And we kind of work on 5 main impact areas, from climate change, resource use, nature and biodiversity, health and well-being, and socio-economic impact. But today we're going to very much be looking at one of those hazards arising from climate change, so quite specific, and that is heat stress and heat waves. So looking first at those kind of risks that we're facing, of course, this can be a whole range and a whole host of risks. And probably the one that we reflect on the most when we think back to the heat waves are those kind of health related risks, or how do we feel? So we saw in the chat people feeling sluggish. It's really difficult to kind of motivate yourself or be productive. Sometimes we kind of have like memory loss issues and we just find it really difficult to concentrate. In more kind of serious cases, I guess you can get heat exhaustion or heat strokes as well. And one of the most vulnerable, one of the most important things to consider here is vulnerability. So, if you have people who have existing health conditions, this can be really much more dangerous, particularly if they're kind of respiratory or cardiovascular. And the other kind of vulnerability piece is how able are people to adapt their own environment when it's hot. So think of schools, think of hospitals, care homes, rented accommodation. Not everyone is able to just amend their environment or what they can do in their spaces when it gets really hot. Key stat, I guess, here, the Office of National Statistics kind of released new information on the heat waves in 2022, and 4,500 people died in England due to those high temperatures. This is the highest number we've ever seen, so it's really important. We're probably going to see it increase a lot more. It's not just people, though. The natural environment and our biodiversity can massively be impacted through the hot weather. Things like water shortages, droughts, loss of habitats, these are all kinds of things that we see affecting the natural environment. Infrastructure as well, I'm sure you've all seen the rail networks. They can really be impacted when temperatures reach a certain level, and that's often due to things like the rails buckling when they get too hot. So if we then think on the secondary impacts of that, this can really impact businesses and organizations too if staff can't get to work, or if transport and supply chains are impacted as well. So it's kind of I kind of see it as like spaghetti. All things are kind of interconnected, and it's that wider system that we need to look at. Of course, the big kind of elephant in the room then is that climate change is likely to increase the number of instances and the intensities of heat waves due to climate change. So in the summer, we saw Sadiq Khan said that multiple days of 45 degrees are possible in the foreseeable future. So we need to make sure that we're considering heat stress risks, because the impacts there could be for London. The underground could be shut. Schools and care homes would not be fit unless well adapted. So it's really crucial. And I have put some maps on the right here. These are just projections for the UK showing the change in maximum summer temperatures depending on how well we mitigate our greenhouse gas emissions. So don't worry too much about the kind of science of it, but RCP 8.5, or the top left one over here, is our kind of worst case scenario, and RCP 2.6, the bottom right, is our best case scenario. But in all instances, we're likely to see an increase in our maximum summer temperatures. So we need to be thinking about it. So how can we know what our level of heat stress risk is? And then how can we adapt and change our environment to reduce that risk? Firstly, and I always say this, first step is really to be able to understand what level of risk you are facing in as much detail as possible. And to make sure that we're all kind of initially on the same page. When we're looking at risk in kind of basic terms, that is understanding our vulnerability and our exposure to risks. Or I guess a different way of looking at it could be probability and consequence. So how likely is this hazard to happen, and what would the level of impact be? For overheating risks, it has been really positive to see our policy moving forward on this. So if you don't know, Building Regulations Part O came into effect in June 2022, and this covers overheating mitigation considerations. However, crucially, this only applies to new build residential buildings. So we don't have a building regulations part for the commercial kind of schools or hospitals or existing homes at the moment. And there's no requirement to use future climate data when we're assessing overheating risk. So homes being built now aren't being designed to be resilient for future temperatures. And fun statistic to kind of throw in there, it's already estimated that 20% of our UK homes already overheat during relatively normal summer conditions, and that 80% of our housing stock will be in use by 2050. So we have a slight problem if we're not looking at that future climate data when we're deciding at the moment. In Part O, there's kind of two methodologies that you can use that are kind of being proposed. One is a kind of simplified method where you assess risk based on certain building elements, like things like your orientation and layout that we kind of said about earlier, or it could just be like the building materials that you're using and the level of ventilation. The other way that you can look at this is through dynamic thermal modelling, and this is aligned with the CIBSE TM52 and TM59 guidance, if you haven't heard of that before. That methodology is much more in-depth. You essentially build a digital model of your building and you run certain weather files to understand what level of internal temperature can you get to. And crucially, you can input future weather files to understand what our heat stress risk would look like in future years. But obviously, as that is not a building regulations requirement, we don't always see it happen yet. But I would definitely recommend doing it if you're doing that level of assessment. The other kind of bit around this, if you're looking at this from a kind of area or a portfolio kind of level, you don't necessarily need to go into that level of detail that you would on a building kind of scale. So there are a whole host of free data sets, tools, and maps out there which give you guidance on what we expect the climate to look like in the future and what temperatures we are projected to reach. So you can look at that information. You can look at it to assess your vulnerability and assign your hazard levels from kind of very low to very high risk, or to attempt to reduce our uncertainty on what heat stress risk could look like in the future. And if you'd like more information on kind of how to do that, UKGBC has produced a framework for measuring and reporting risks last year. So that doesn't cover just overheating, it looks like a range of risks, but it might be a useful place to start if you're completely new to this issue. So what can help or hinder when we're looking at either assessing, designing new buildings or adapting our existing buildings? If we've assessed our risks and it's coming up as moderate to high to very high, or if we're seeing through our dynamic model that internal temperatures are reaching beyond what's comfortable, we need to kind of be looking at the ways in which we can adapt our built environment. Very easy to kind of say we can put air conditioning in and that would solve the problem. But that's an example of what we would call a maladaptation. So it might solve the one issue that we're really focused on, which would be heat stress risk, but it could have a detrimental impact elsewhere. So in the case of air conditioning, Our electricity network, we know, is already massively constrained at the moment. We're essentially trying to squeeze every last kilowatt of power out of it. So we need to be looking at those different ways to adapt to the heat. And air conditioning should really only be used as a last resort, or if it's necessary for a kind of vulnerability purpose. So I've listed a few things to consider here when either designing or retrofitting a place or a building. Key element to kind of keep in mind with all of this is that it's really crucial to try and keep the heat out as much as possible rather than letting it in first and then having to kind of expel it out afterwards. So that's something that we found that's increasingly more difficult to do, particularly in heat wave events. So if we can keep it out in the first instance, great. If not, then ventilation kind of comes into play. So firstly, it's probably location. Where's your building located, or where is your area located? Is this rural or urban? You might have come across the term urban heat island effect before, but that is essentially where we see urban areas that have less green are absorbing heat a lot more, and overall the kind of air temperature is elevated, it's increased because we've got that absorbing and then letting out of heat during the nighttime. So you don't necessarily see that as much in rural areas. So definitely one to consider if you are designing or building in main cities or just urban areas in general. How is your building laid out? What's its orientation? Something that's come up a couple of times. If you're designing new builds, it can be really important to kind of site bedrooms on the coolest side, which is usually north facing, because sleep comes up as a main issue of kind of heat stress risk and comfort, comfortability, I guess. If people can't sleep, it has those knock-on impacts and can really affect us on health issues as well. Materials, I'd say, is a crucial one. So the color of materials can be really important. This is due to what's called the albedo effect. So lighter colored materials can reflect more heat and light from the sun rather than absorbing it in. A good example of this is Greece, where if you can imagine like the lovely Greek buildings, they're all painted in white, and that is to basically reflect the heat off, so it's nice and lovely and cool inside. Glazing as well, which is still very popular. We have a kind of huge risk of what we call solar heat gain in buildings through glazing. Basically, it means that it's very easy for the light and the heat energy from the sun to pass through the windows. So internal temperatures can rise very quickly if we have a lot of glazing, particularly on the south-facing facade. That one can be difficult as well because we're trying to balance good levels of daylight access with overheating risk and energy efficiency, but definitely one to keep an eye on if you are designing. One method of keeping that changeable, I guess, is shading methods. So think of things like shutters or overhangs. We don't see these just as much in the UK, but they are one of the most effective ways of reducing our internal temperatures and that essential bit of keeping heat out as much as possible so that we don't have to expel it. And ventilation is probably one that I would bring up. This is absolutely crucial in any kind of overheating strategy or risk or looking at um, how we could mitigate or how we could expel that internal temperatures. So this can be difficult as sometimes we have quite a lot of trade-offs with ventilation. One of the ones I always think of is with natural ventilation. So sometimes if we think of like a high-rise building in a city, we are sometimes restricted by small window opening sizes or acoustic limits if we're in noisy urban areas as well. So just making sure that we've got a really good ventilation system just to expel that air out is absolutely essential and crucial. Behavior of occupants and kind of increases in internal temperatures naturally from either people or equipment in a room can also increase that internal temperatures. So really just quite simple but effective measures like switching off unused equipment or teaching people not to open the windows if it's hotter outside can really help on that. And then the final one I've noted is access to green spaces or use of green infrastructure, which kind of brings me on to our external environment as well. And at UKGBC, we often talk about nature-based solutions quite a lot. and the multiple benefits that they can bring. So, nature-based solutions, whenever we're talking about them, these can be any adaptation action that aims to protect, sustainably manage, or restore natural or modified ecosystems, but that they also address societal challenges effectively and adaptively. So, this could be things like human well-being, it could be biodiversity benefits. We've also seen things like land and property value increase if you've used things like street trees or green roofs or green walls and things like that. For overheating in particular, it's probably most beneficial to highlight the role that nature can play in reducing our overall temperatures. So you might have seen similar things to this image on the left before, I don't know. But quite a few case studies have been undertaken using thermal imaging cameras to see that difference in surface temperature between areas that are shaded by trees and then the non-shaded areas as well. And here you can see it's a massive 20 degrees difference. I know this was taken in Australia, so they are going to have hotter temperatures than we are. But that's huge. That's absolutely, I think it's a crucial thing that we need to be bringing more into our built environment. Other nature-based solutions could be things like open parks and green spaces, green roofs and green walls, trees, even things like sustainable urban drainage systems. These can all help both on these climate risks, but also on those wider benefits as well. Going back to our kind of risk assessment methodologies piece, so think the CIBSE TM52, TM59, or our simplified method, it can be quite difficult to show these elements in models or to kind of have the data to back up those assumptions. Um, so I always highlight a piece of work that was produced by the Ignition project team a few years ago, where they really looked at this issue directly and produced some really useful databases on how different nature-based solutions can help with things like internal temperature reduction. So I think you'll get the slides after this, but there's a little link there, which if you go to the databases, it's per nature-based solution, and it will have all the different issues and it will have all the research. So you'll have things like if you put a green roof on a building, this is that kind of internal temperature reduction that you were likely to see. So that's always very useful. This isn't something that we just think about inside our work lives either. And very often, adaptation action can happen at a community level. It doesn't necessarily have to focus on the design or the maintenance of a building. This is something that we are looking at UKGBC as well, and particularly the question of can we build community resilience to hazards like heat waves, or what could the built environment do to enable that? During COVID, we saw communities come together a lot more to kind of build those networks to support each other, in some cases, put plans in place as well. So there's kind of two things that I'd like to think about on this kind of scale. Firstly, can we adapt how we're designing and developing our built environment to allow for the facilitation of these networks? That could be things like creating cooled community centres or just in the kind of maintenance phase or the management and operation phase, just creating that network of local communities, local businesses and organizations and residents. How can we come together? Also, outside of work, how could you contribute to your own community as well? Are there people who are more vulnerable in your local area? Could it be setting up a cool space for those that aren't able to maintain the temperatures inside their homes? Could it be education? A lot of people are unaware of the best things to do in a heat wave. So if you are an overheating assessment expert, perhaps you could teach these behavioural techniques. I don't know. Could it be incorporating nature-based thinking? Could it be planting trees or just implementing different pieces of green infrastructure in your local area? I've kind of highlighted two maps here as well, which I think are really nice examples of where this has kind of been going. So the London Cool Spaces map is a map that shows all the different areas across London during the summer months that you can go to, which are cooler, or you would be able to cool down in a heat wave. The Keep Bristol Cool map also then shows vulnerability to heat stress risk on a ward level. So really useful for planning kind of adaptation methodologies as well, particularly if we're going to design a new building in one of those wards. So this is my penultimate slide. So I just wanted to finish on a few things to consider when looking at different options for adapting as well. So if you do have questions, start thinking of them now. And another and kind of nice example that I wanted to highlight as well was this really handy document from the Climate Change Committee that they produced on risks to health, well-being, and productivity. They've got like a really nice list in there of different options that you can use. So I would definitely recommend having a look at that as well. But just whilst we're on the kind of final point, there are a few things which are really important to consider when planning kind of adaptation action, and that includes heat stress risks. So, first one, capital and operational expenditure. Um, Really crucial, particularly if you are looking at the kind of nature inclusion side as well. What maintenance is required, how much does it cost, and who is going to be doing it? Really crucial to have that implemented in, planned in time. Implementation time as well. Some actions might take you a long time to implement, whilst your risk is still increasing. So you might need to incorporate temporary measures in the meantime if you identify kind of a high risk of overheating. You might just need to put something in place whilst you're retrofitting a building or making some amendments to a building. Avoiding lock-in. This is avoiding any decisions that will take you down a permanent route of action, or by making any decisions that you can't retract or change in the future. This goes back to the kind of uncertainty of we don't necessarily know where climate change is going to go based on our kind of policies and actions. So we don't want to lock ourselves into making a certain decision. Negative side effects as well, and maladaptation, as I said earlier. So air conditioning being the kind of good example of this. We don't want to make sure, we do want to make sure that we're not exacerbating other issues like increasing greenhouse gas emissions. And then finally, are there any other kind of multiple benefits that you could get through incorporating adaptation measures? So very much these kind of nature-based solutions elements. What other benefits can we see as well? So just to summarize, a few key takeaways. It's absolutely imperative to consider heat stress risks in the design, retrofit, and management of our built environment at the moment. We are starting to do this a lot more, but there's still quite a way that we can go. Understanding current and future risk before planning your adaptation approach is really critical, I would say, and ensuring I've kind of bolded that future word as well. Even though we don't necessarily have to do it through policy at the moment, I think we need to be doing this just to make sure that our built environment is safe and comfortable for the lifetime it's for its duration. And we have a range of methods for adapting to heat stress risk already. Some of them are quite simple, some of them much less simple. I know that. But let's start using them. We can absolutely start doing this now. We're starting to see summer heat waves and heat wave events happening a lot more often. So let's start putting these into place. That was all. Thank you very much. I guess, yeah, any questions?
Thank you so much, Hannah. What a great start to this discussion. There are already some questions here, so I will jump in. And the first one is, unsurprisingly, from Carolyn Murray on Papa Porca on retrofit. I think we could expect that
Yes.
through your talk. You mentioned that part O was really only about new buildings, but um, the question is, how might retrofit or insulation impact or play a role?
Amazing question. I love it. So, retrofit first, and then I'll come on to insulation specifically. Retrofit, we are missing a huge opportunity at the moment because we have such a focus on climate mitigation and reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and making sure that we are retrofitting, particularly our housing building stock, with things like PV and heat pumps. But what we're not doing is kind of having that thought of, okay, what's my level of risk to physical hazards like heat stress? How could I put things in place that tackle both of those issues at once? Or if I'm going up onto the roof to put PV on, let's have a look at like, I know this isn't heat stress risk, but let's look at like flood protection or like how's the waterproofing doing? Or if I'm putting scaffolding up already, how can I save money and just do it all at once? So crucially, consider both at the same time.
So
Insulation,
integrated thinking,
thinking,
basically.
yes, systems approach. Yeah, how can we be just thinking about all of this? And I guess nature is the other thing there as well. Like, could we be improving our biodiversity? Yes, if it's like a house, this would be on quite a small scale. But if everyone's thinking about it, naturally it's going to start building up and will create those networks that we want. Insulation is a really interesting one as well. And I did actually do a bit of research on this because it wasn't very clear. Because I think you'd naturally think that if you're putting loads of insulation in, you're going to increase the risk of overheating. It's not necessarily the case to do that. So there are a few studies out there. I don't remember the names of who did them. But the key crucial thing is ventilation. So the main result was it's better to put your insulation in so that you are then protected over winter. Absolutely crucial that we do that for cold frost events as well. Linking back to vulnerability, people need to be protected from the cold weather events. But it's fine to have that insulation in as long as you've got a good ventilation system and you can expel that hot air out. Hopefully that
I
makes
did publish a paper in our next edition of The Developer, and one of the results was that roof insulation is very good at tackling both overheating
yes.
and heat escape. So,
Yeah.
so that was another one. But it also did underline mechanical ventilation or ventilation in general. But
Yeah.
interestingly, it was saying that the roof was really important. And you've been talking about roofs yourself, but I'm sure insulation and green roofs. There's actually a question from our next speaker today, Amanda Skeldon, Director of Climate and Nature at JLL. What would be one thing, one big thing, or the first step that you would recommend taking to start addressing heat stress?
Oh, good question. I'm going to cheat and do two if that's okay. Sorry. So
We'll allow that.
my one big thing would be first understanding heat stress risk, because I think we sometimes understand it, but not in the level of detail that we would necessarily need to know. So that's my main takeaway. If we do one thing from this call, go and understand heat stress risk that you face either in your home or your workplace or wherever it may be. If it's a practical action, then I'm going to do a shout out for shutters because they are just the best thing that we can put in place. I think the ignition study showed this. My master's research showed this as well. Shutters on that kind of limiting internal temperature level, shutters have the biggest potential that we can put in place. It's a bit, we don't really see them in the UK that much. I think
Well,
we
you're
tend to
talking
see,
about external shutters, right?
yeah,
You're
external,
not a
yeah.
fan of internal shutters, which
I
are more common or very
massively
Victorian.
fan, but they're not as effective because then the heat is already in the room. They've gone through the glass and it's in there, so it's harder to get it out. Whereas if it's external, it keeps it outside. So yes, we have a problem that our windows open the wrong way in the UK, which is something that we will need to think about. But I would love it if every house had shutters on. Oh, that's the dream.
So we're okay with the sash window, which of course is got other
Yes.
problems in terms of energy efficiency. But you're saying our windows open out, so all of a sudden we're putting our shutters indoors. So we need windows to open in and
Yeah.
external shutters.
Yeah.
Is
And
this
then
is this a vernacular, blocker for us, an aesthetic blocker, or would we not have the right behaviors anyway to use them? Or do you see that all as kind of pretty surmountable, um, or do you think it's going to be an issue? Is it an aesthetic issue, or is it just
not sure.
it's
And
a even a
maybe it
window
isn't.
issue?
Yeah, maybe it's like a vernacular aesthetic issue. Maybe it's because we don't see it. So it's just not naturally in our minds to put it into a design. Um, I think particularly if I think back to my planning days, we had quite a focus on daylight as well and letting enough daylight into houses. And particularly if we have kind of short distances between buildings, we might want to we wouldn't really think to put a shutter on at all because you want to maximize your light levels in. But I think it's a changeable option. So you could change it. You could still have that daylight. You could still have that sunlight, but you could then have the option to close it when it's really hot. So yeah, I'm not entirely sure why not. I would just like to see more of them.
Hugh Chapman comments about how large trees can provide a significant cooling effect, but they don't grow overnight. And
Yeah.
finding an opportunity to plant large urban trees is not always easy. We do have quite a high death rate for urban trees as well. So how realistic is it to expect trees or to use trees as a kind of retrofit measure?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the main things that is probably better for us to do is to focus on keeping or preserving our existing trees that we have. We're still seeing a lot of trees being cut down, particularly in urban areas. So let's just reduce that as much as possible because they will be the older, the more instated trees that would have a much broader tree leaf cover. With trees, I think the main thing is that one tree on its own isn't going to produce a large effect. It will have some effect, and that's absolutely fine. But like clusters of trees are really going to be the thing that is crucial there. So again, if you're thinking on green infrastructure strategy, a lot of the time it's that network of what can we put in place that isn't just one item or one element, but how does it all connect together? And then what is that overall kind of cumulative impact that you can have? That's probably what I would say. But yeah, not massively always easy. I appreciate that.
There's a question from David Chipperfield Architects about Part O's take on single aspect dwellings. What more do you think could be done through legislation to support improved solutions beyond new build resi? It's kind of two
Yeah,
questions. So single aspect dwellings and legislation in terms of beyond new build resi. Mm-hmm.
absolutely. So yeah, one of the main issues with single aspect dwellings, in case people aren't that familiar with it, is that you don't get as much cross ventilation. So if you've just got one facade face, the air can't like move through a building as much. Um, I'm not
So you would have
entirely.
you would have flats with windows on one side or
Yeah,
offices with windows on one side. And
yeah.
yes. Mhm.
So you
So
can't.
you might be entirely south facing. So you
Yes.
can't do that thing, but moving between them. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which for ventilation, you kind of want that cross flow as much as possible. And again, for kind of solar heat gain and for the sun, if it is just south facing, those people wouldn't have like a different facade to go to. So if we think back to that like orientation layout kind of piece, it's nice to have bedrooms kind of north facing because that's where people want to sleep. That's where we kind of get into trouble sometimes when our bodies can't cool down. If they've been hot in the day, they want to cool down at nighttime. So yes, single aspect dwellings can be a bit of an issue. I'm not entirely sure what Part O says on them, but I'm definitely happy to go and have a little read. It's not a huge document, so be interesting to read that actually. I would probably think that the simplified method would take that into account, and I know that the dynamic thermal model does take that into account specifically. So yes. What more could be done through legislation to support improved solutions beyond new build resi? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, it is to have a kind of Part O equivalent for either non-residential buildings um, or for existing buildings. I think the problem with retrofit is we have no incentive to retrofit our homes for overheating and heat stress risk at the moment. Um, I'm not. For me, that is just let's put a policy in place to do it, but that's a difficult challenge to win. I'm afraid. Don't know how quickly we will see that, but I think it is being considered a lot more, and particularly at the local authority scale, I think we're seeing a lot more action on that as well.
Joseph Baines from Sport London wants to know whether there are any examples of natural climate adaptation that we can learn from Middle Eastern countries, such as ventilation or cooling yards, that we can apply in London. And are we currently seeing this in practice?
Very interesting. I often get this question on European climate adaptation as well and what we can learn. And I think, it can be from any kind of countries. We can see it from Australia as well. They've very much had to deal with both heat waves and wildfires as well, which we started to see in the UK. Um, Natural climate adaptations. So the kind of methods that we, I guess, see, and I don't see many examples of it happening like in London yet, but I've definitely seen it come through in certain designs over the last year or so, is probably those albedo effect materials. So really simply, like you can paint something white or have reflective materials. Um, and the kind of, I don't quite know how to word this, but when buildings are kind of built a little bit like into a cave, so it's got a bit cave-like and it's a bit cooler
So
inside, or the
overhangs, basically. Yeah.
overhangs. Yeah, we've definitely seen more overhangs come into play. We've definitely seen more green infrastructure come into play as well. You do get good examples of that in the cities. Um, those would be the kinds of things. And then shutters is the one that I haven't really seen that much yet, but I want.
So there's a question from Murdad Borna from London, the Mayor of London's OPDC. How can we ensure that the mitigation of the urban heat island, which is evidently beneficial during hot summers and heat waves, does not inadvertently lead to an increase in energy consumption and emissions when reducing those urban temperatures in colder seasons?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this comes back to that point of maladaptation, and that we need to be considering not just the one issue that we're trying to solve, but what are the kind of knock-on impacts that that one adaptation can have. So if it is things like air conditioning, or in some cases mechanical ventilation, keeping a check on what is the energy consumption, what are the carbon emissions associated with this, is there something else I could do first that isn't going to cost energy and CO2 to reduce those temperatures, and have that as a kind of backup option, or something that we do in the future when it gets to those kind of really unbearable summers. That comes back into those things like the shutters, the green infrastructure, the nature-based solutions, the things like albedo and painting a material, a building or a certain material, a different color. That would be those kind of first, we call them like low or no regrets options that I would go with, test them, see what the internal temperature reduction is, and then go to energy consuming kind of methods if that's like the last resort that we do. I guess with the urban heat island effect as well, it's a lot more about our external environments and not just our internal environment. So if we can get more greenery in there, it's going to naturally reduce the urban heat island effect. If we've got less kind of concrete and kind of those hard materials that are absorbing all the heat in, that's going to naturally reduce, and our overall air temperature will reduce as well. So that will help.
Well, one thing that Hala Al Hadid was calling for yesterday, she presented on urban canyons and the urban canyon effect, was for local plans to be far more specific about temperature bands.
Yeah.
Especially, she was looking at High Street specifically, but she was saying, we could plan much better. We could actually determine how high the buildings should be in terms of
Yeah.
what ground temperatures we thought were acceptable in terms of overheating and too cold. And she was very much concerned about both,
Yeah.
but saying that really needs to be kind of a locally set parameter, and then actually that would dictate building form from the outside. But of course, she's speaking from a public realm. You're speaking about what's going in on inside the building, but they are, of course, completely interlinked
Completely,
with the.
completely interlinked. Yeah, definitely. Another example of the kind of systems thinking approach. What's going on outside my building that would impact my building, and vice versa? How does my building impact the local area as well?
So Claire Daly from Sustrans, Scotland, is weighing in on trees because we've had a few kind of catch-up comments about trees itself. Often the excuse used for not planting trees in urban areas, or trees that grow large, which to a
Mhm.
large scale, is underground services. broadband and gas? And are there examples of how that can be dealt with?
This is funny. My husband is a utilities engineer, so we often have this argument between us.
This is a dinner
Um,
conversation.
this is
You
a
and your
classic.
utilities.
Yes, classic dinner conversation. Yeah, that this is a huge issue, and our kind of legacy infrastructure and the infrastructures that we use are going to create those kind of barriers and boundaries. I'm just trying to think because I know that there's a case study of where they did this on the Ignition Living Lab. So I'm happy to go and dig that out after this session as well. But I think they raised tree pits up so that they're not going into the ground itself, that they are above the utilities and in kind of boxes. And then obviously your tree will grow to the amount of space that it has. So they kind of knew the overall kind of how big these trees are going to grow. And it wasn't huge, but you could plan for that. It also kind of helped on the maintenance side of things because they knew that it wasn't going to kind of grow to this massive level and overshade this building over here. And you'd have to kind of do more maintenance over here and things like that. So there are ways to do it. And I think there are technologies that you can use to do it as well. Um, I have something in my head and I can't remember what it's called, but it was like a kind of membrane that you can put around the tree roots that makes sure it doesn't go past certain levels. Because I think often concrete is used, which we don't really want to be doing with kind of embodied carbon of concrete. So if it's a way of we want to plant the tree, it can't be beyond this kind of level. There are certain technologies out there that allow you to do that. But yeah, you might be
It
like,
doesn't feel like it doesn't sound like happy mycelium though, does it? I mean, these trees in cages. No.
it wasn't. It, yeah, it will stunt the tree to a certain growth level, which isn't great. But if it's the option of having a tree versus not having a tree in an urban environment, I would probably go for having the tree over not.
Amanda's helpfully shared in the Q&A tabs a link to the Ignition Living
Amazing.
Lab Hub with information on tree pits. So if anyone wants to pop over to the Q&A tab, they can pick that up and learn about the unhappy yet useful
They
nature-based
might be
solutions
happy.
that we can put in there. They, yes, less unhappy trees. So I think there's the added comment from Hugh Chapman is that there are various technologies, but most are only available for smaller species or will limit the ultimate size of the tree, which is what you were saying. So the
Yeah.
idea of these, but we look around our cities, and as you pointed out, there have been mass tree cuttings of big trees in Sheffield, of course, in London lately, around Euston, the felling of the large plane trees, they're hugely emotive issues as well.
Yeah.
Interestingly, we talk about the public, a lot of voice to the public, certain members of the public being against traffic calming measures, but we do see the public come out for trees. They do seek to kind of defend them, feel very passionately about these large trees. Is that something the UKGBC is engaging with, the kind of anti-felling?
Probably less for a UK GBC point of view. Well, that would probably come under our like political advocacy work on that. We would very much recommend that we need to keep our trees and green infrastructure where it is and do not go and damage that, touch that at all. Um, for me, I think this is like a hugely cultural issue as well. And some people, you know, if you've grown up next to a piece of land or a certain tree, or you have happy memories with that tree, you are going to feel that connection. And there's a lot of particularly kind of financial value sometimes placed on nature, and that kind of decision of do we cut or do we leave, or what kind of impact is that going to have on um, the value or the finances of our building and property. It doesn't necessarily cover those other wider values that aren't included in the cost calculations at the moment. So we've done a bit of work on the value of urban nature-based solutions as well last year. I think that came out, and that kind of asks that question of what value are we looking at the moment, particularly for capital and operational expenditure? What are we missing out on? What are we not considering? Like, what wider do we need to think about before we make these decisions? Because it's really crucial. And yeah, we will lose our natural environment if we don't have those kind of considerations in mind.
Well, I mean, and it certainly dovetails with this discussion in the asset risk or the building risk and the housing risk associated with overheating, and how large trees can really help us to cool our spaces. And as a public, free access to shade becomes increasingly important. You know, these ideas of shade equity, and air pollution, too, and not to mention that all of these great ecosystem services, as we like to
Absolutely.
call them, also known as trees. So I want to thank you very much. That's actually the end of our session. It just breezed past. Thank you to everyone for your questions. We are back in 10 minutes with Amanda Skeldon. So do stick around. We're going to be talking about carbon tunnel vision, which is when you're so focused on cutting carbon that maybe you miss other opportunities. We were talking about thinking in an integrated way. So what are the other wins? You might miss them while you're focused on one thing and not another. So we're going to be talking about taking that holistic view. Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and thank you for all the questions.
See you in 10 minutes.